All right, if bikes were people, the Unno Mith would be Pablo Picasso. The folks over at Unno clearly tapped into their Spanish art heritage when they designed this thing. It is pretty impressive. I don't know if I've ever seen a bike that looks this good. All right, let's cover a couple of details before we go ride. The Mith is a long travel mixed wheel e-bike. It uses Unno's Cero suspension design, which is basically a virtual pivot. And interestingly, it's designed to be run at really high sag, between 30 and 40%. Speaking of suspension setup, the biggest and really only gripe I have about this bike comes around setting the bike up. Some people care way too damn much about what their bike looks like. Don't get me wrong, I can appreciate a good looking bicycle, but when it comes down to it, I don't really care what it looks like if the performance is there and the function is there. Just trying to thread on the shock pump took 2 David Goggins motivational speeches, a near mental breakdown, and chucking some wrenches across the garage. Measuring sag, adjusting damper settings, getting the integrated handlebar and stem just right, even just plugging in the e-bike charger is a little bit finicky. Luckily, out on the trail, that did a complete Unno reverse, and that setup became well worth it. So let's jump into the climbing. I am a big fan of the Bosch Performance Line CX drive system. I think it is one of the better performing e-bike drive systems out there. That's what's on the Mith, and it makes climbing pretty okay. There is plenty of power, there's good range, and it doesn't really have too many bugs or kinks to work out. And then the Mith itself complements that Bosch drive system very well. So on the climbs, the Mith is relatively mild-mannered. The suspension is good, the geometry is well balanced, and the handling is surprising for a big bike like this. Out of all of the mixed wheel EMTBs I've ever ridden, this one feels the most mullet. That small back wheel is especially beneficial on this bike. It spins up quickly, and it makes that rear end feel quite a bit more agile. Considering how long the overall wheelbase is on this, I think that's very necessary. It's not all that difficult to get this bike around a tight switchback or to pick your way through some tricky sections. The body position and balance on the Mith make it great on steep climbs. I tend to like the e-bike for those stupid rides with impossible climbs and sketchy descents, and the Mith fits that bill perfectly. So I have a litmus test for e-bike climbing ability on steep terrain, and this climb is particularly difficult because it gets so steep that you can't keep the front end down. So you end up wheeling up it, losing control of the front end, and then you're kind of stuck. It's actually a little bit surprising that the Mith handled this so well because the front end is really tall, but the rear center is also kind of long for a mixed wheel bike, which keeps you centered up maybe a little bit better on the bike so you don't loop out and wheelie up the really steep climbs. The Mith's suspension design provides a good amount of traction. At 35+% sag, the suspension feels rather active to me, and not that I mind. That's usually what I prefer on an e-bike anyway. I'm not really all that concerned about pedaling efficiency when I've got a motor. I would much rather have the traction and control. So I really liked the comfort and the calmness of the more active rear end on the Mith. It sticks to the ground really well, provides a lot of traction, contours the bumps, makes it easy just to pedal up stuff. So the Bosch Performance Line CX motor is a good match for the Mith. It's plenty powerful and the range is pretty good, especially with the big battery in this thing. Don't plan on swapping batteries mid-ride for those mega days though, because the battery is integrated into the down tube. You'll have to pull the motor to get it out. And I've been thinking about this, but I'd really like to see a standardized race across e-bike motors. Say the Rider puts out 250 watts, all the bikes are in full boost, and I'd like to see which one is the fastest on flat ground as well as in really steep terrain. And I have a feeling the Bosch might be the overall winner across both of those types of terrain. I might know a guy who could make that happen too. So now let's get into descending, and the overarching theme of this bike on the descents is how good that suspension feels. It is some pretty magical stuff. The closest bike I can think of is the Rocky Mountain Altitude, which I just rode recently. They have a very similar ultra deep, really active but supportive feel. So like I said earlier, the Mith is designed for higher sag numbers than most bikes. I'm in that 35% range, maybe just a little bit more. and it makes the bike hug the ground really well. It contours all the bumps and all of the trail chatter, smoothing things out nicely. Maybe the best way to describe it is if you've ever ridden a tire insert and been able to drop your tire pressures like 5 or 6 PSI or whatever, and now your bike just kind of pitter patters and contours the ground really well. That's what the Mith feels like, but on steroids. It plows through almost everything in its way. It does lead to a bit more difficulty bunny hopping and getting this bike off the ground though. Obviously a little bit less sag would help with that, but then you lose some of that plushness and some of that comfort and the confidence and control that comes with the higher sag, so pick your poison. So while the off the top feel is pretty soft and active, the bike doesn't seem to wallow in the middle or run out of travel for the bigger hits. And yeah, there's plenty of suspension. There's 160 millimeters available, so it kind of makes sense that you're not bottoming out all the time. But I guess the part that isn't quite so apparent is that even at 35 to 40% sag, you can still have decent mid-stroke and bottom out control. I like the geometry on the Mith quite a bit. For the bike's use case, it is very fitting. Nothing seems out of place, nothing is odd, nothing feels outdated or too crazy. It's just about right, just about everywhere. The head tube angle is slack, as you'd expect for a bike like this. The reach is long, and you pair those two things with a rather long chainstay for a 27.5-inch rear wheel bike, and you've got a very long wheelbase. The Mith is very stable in both the rough and at high speeds. I also really appreciate the tall front end on this bike. As far as stack heights go, it is up there with the tallest I have ever seen. And that gives the bike a certain degree of confidence in steep terrain, as well as a kind of comfortable upright riding position. It can, on the other hand, lead to some difficulties in weighting the front wheel properly, especially on that flatter, mellower terrain. I tend to ride my bike pretty far over the front anyway, so I personally don't have problems with this, but I can see some folks who don't get along with that very well. So I'm not totally sure why, but the rear wheel feels extra mullet on the Mith. The back end feels very quick to get around a corner. I'm not sure I've ridden many bikes that scream, I have 2 different sized wheels, quite like the Mith. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing either. Keep in mind this wheelbase is really long, and if this bike was a full 29er, it would be even longer. So I do think the shorter tucked in rear wheel is what this bike needs. And with a lot of MX wheel bikes, you can struggle to find the traction that you'd find on a 29-inch bike, but at high sags like the Mith is designed to use, you're not fighting for traction at all on this thing. So there is something special about pushing the Mith into corners with little regard for tire, bike, and human safety. It is a good thing it comes with a double down rear tire because anything less wouldn't stand a chance of staying on the rim. It's really, really easy to pump into corners. I'm not sure if it's the stability, the traction, the low BB, the mixed wheels, or what, but cornering on the Mith is really nice, which is a little bit weird to say because the wheelbase is very long. Because it's long, it never feels squirrely, it feels good in rough corners and steep corners and high speed corners, but it just never feels difficult to get around a corner. There is one caveat though, I guess, and that's that you do need a little bit of speed. At slower speeds, you do start to notice how long this bike actually is. One minor complaint I have about the Mith is there is a little bit of rattle. I personally don't care about a noisy bike all that much. I do know that some folks care a lot about that. There is a little bit of cable rattle in the down tube, and then I've also noticed pebbles and little rocks find their way under the motor cover and they sit there and rattle around. I don't know how they get in there, if they sneak in around the side or fall in from the top up by the shock. Either way, I've had to pull the motor cover off a couple of times to get pebbles out. So let's do a couple of comparisons now. And it makes a lot of sense to compare this to the Orbea Wild. They both use the same motor and have similar travel lengths and geometry. They couldn't feel more different, however, out on the trail. While the Mith feels plush and deep and gooey, the Wild feels really sporty and firm and quick. Maybe the best way to describe them is by saying the Wild is the sports car and the Mith is the trophy truck. You have to think the biggest difference between these bikes comes down to that suspension feel. Next up, let's talk about the Transition Repeater powertrain. Again, we have very similar travel lengths and geometry. The drive systems are different. The Repeater obviously uses SRAM's powertrain and the Mith has the Bosch. The Repeater sits somewhere between the Wild and the Mith for me in terms of ride quality. The Wild is firmer and sportier and the Mith is plusher and gooier. It's maybe a little more balanced and kind of sits right in the middle. It would be tough to say which one of these two, the Repeater or the Mith, would be more capable. Repeater does have two 29-inch wheels, at least how I rode it and how it comes stock, which does help it carry some speed and momentum through the rough a little bit better. But I think you'd be really hard pressed to say it's more capable than the Mith. I think they're both very willing to take on rough terrain. Who is the Mith for? I really like it for 3 different groups. The first group would be the corner smackers. So if you really like trying to peel your tires off in every corner, you're probably really going to like the Mith because it's really good at doing that. For whatever reason, it's pretty impressive in the corner. The Mith is also great for folks who like that bottomless feeling suspension design where it feels like the ground below you just does not exist. It's very soft off the top and it's supportive near the end. So it's great for those folks who want to stick their heels down and just plow through everything. Maybe they're a little bit less inclined to jump and bunny hop and goof around. They just want to go straight and really fast. The Mith would be good for that. Last up are the folks who I've talked about before who care too damn much about how their bike looks. Because if you care too damn much about how your bike looks, the Mith is one of the best looking bikes that I think I've ever seen. Of course, that's subjective, but I don't think many people are going to argue that. If you don't like talking to people on the trail about your bicycle, don't buy the Mith because it is a person stopper. People will ask you about it. So there you have it. That's going to do it. See you next time.